Welcome to this video on critical reasoning. This is the first video in the series and we're going to start from the very basics of critical reasoning. We will start with different parts of an argument, and based on those different parts we have a few question types like assumption, strengthen, weaken and evaluate the argument. We are going to discuss all of them. And before we get started with the video, please don't forget to visit us at perfectscores.com. You can also like the page and share us at Facebook by going to facebook.com/perfectscores. And in case you wish to share any valuable feedback or you have a query for us, you can always drop in a mail at perfectscores89@gmail.com. So let's get started with this video. Now, basically, before going on to parts of the argument, I would like to discuss the format of the question. A lot of you would already be knowing that the question of a critical reasoning argument is basically composed of three parts. One is the argument itself, and then what you have is basically your question stem that asks you what you're supposed to do, whether do you have to strengthen the argument or do you have to weaken it, but it's all related to this argument. And finally you have 5 answer options. Now, contrary to what most people say, that in verbal part of GMAT you do not have any perfect answers, you just have to choose the best answer, that is totally wrong. For every answer you will have a proof, you will have a proper reasoning why it is the correct answer, and for every wrong option as well you will be able to eliminate it using some reasoning. So basically you have to remember the argument, the question stem and the options. Now this is important even for the purpose of your essay, the AW essay, because in the analytical writing assessment as well, what you get is basically an argument, although it's lengthier than the argument that you find in the critical reasoning question. But whatever terms and terminology we'll be using over here in this video today, like conclusion, premises, assumptions, everything, you'll be making use of that in your essay as well. So please take care to listen to this video very carefully. Coming to the different types of questions. Strengthening the argument is a very common type. Weakening is more common, I would say. Then you have assumption questions, again very common, and inference questions. Now these 4 question types are going to make a very big part of the critical reasoning part of your GMAT sentence correction. I could say about 70% to 80% of your critical reasoning questions are based on these 4 question types. The next type of question is identify the reasoning, a very rare one. You may get just one of these in your entire verbal section. Next one is resolve and explain. Resolve or explain. Usually you have a paradox in this kind of question and you have to resolve it or explain why such a paradoxical situation is taking place. The next one is evaluate the argument, which is also connected to strengthen and weaken, so that is something that we'll be including in the video today. Then you have find a flaw in the reasoning. It is similar to identify the reasoning, but also it is similar to weaken, because we have to basically find a flaw, again a rare question type. Then we have some bold-face questions where 2 parts of the entire argument would be written in bold-face and you have to determine the purpose of those parts. And finally you have some questions on complete the passage or complete the argument, where the last part of the argument is left blank and you have to complete it using one of the 5 options. There may be a couple of more questions, a couple of more rare questions, but what you need to remember is that these 4 question types that I'm highlighting over here, these are very important if you want to score well in critical reasoning. You have to be very good. These should be your strong areas: how to strengthen the argument, how to weaken it, how to find the assumptions, inference, and along with that it will be easy for you to go through the evaluate the argument type of questions as well. Now we have parts of an argument in front of us. Now you need to understand that an argument is always comprised of 2 parts. One is the main conclusion and the other is the premise or the premises, which are basically used to support the conclusion. I'll explain this with the help of an example. You have this example in front of you. You must fire John. Now, on its own, it is not a complete valid argument. It is just a random statement. But when you have something like this, you must fire John. He failed to turn up the report on time. You're giving a reason why this activity must be carried out, because he failed to turn up the report on time. So as a result, this supporting evidence is the premise of this argument. And this part, that you must fire John, this becomes the conclusion of the argument. Here is another example for you. I ate chocolate yesterday. Since then, my tooth has started aching. I must reduce consumption of chocolates to prevent toothaches in the future. Now, in this example, when you say I must reduce consumption of chocolates to prevent toothaches in the future, you are asserting something, so that becomes the conclusion of this argument. And what are you giving to support? You are giving an instance where you ate chocolate and then your tooth started aching. So that is the premise. Now, as you can see from these examples, that the conclusion and the premise are clearly stated in the argument most of the times. However, there is one extra thing which is very important, which is basically the assumption. Now remember, assumption is not stated. It is something that the author or the argument has assumed while using the premises to come to the conclusion. As a result, it is always underlying. It is not mentioned directly. For example, in this case, you must fire John. He failed to turn up the report on time. The basic underlying assumption is that if a person does not turn up the report on time, he must be fired. That is why if John did that, he must be fired. So that would be the assumption. Another assumption could be failing to turn up the work is a sole evidence of why you must fire a person. That is enough to get a person fired. So that would also be an assumption. In this case, in the second example of eating chocolates and having toothache, the underlying assumption would be that it's only because that I ate chocolate yesterday that my tooth has started aching. It's no other reason that is responsible for my toothache. Another assumption would be that this pattern is going to repeat itself. It's not just a coincidence. Every time I eat chocolate, my tooth will ache. So as a result, I must stop, or I must reduce my consumption of chocolate. So these two were the basic assumptions. So let's go ahead and revise what these three important parts are. Conclusion is the main point of an argument. It is the assertion that is given by the argument, and usually it is identified by the help of words like thus, hence, must, therefore. Whenever you are recommending something or you are suggesting something, so usually you have these words. Sometimes directly it is mentioned that thus it can be concluded, or the conclusion is this. So it's very easy to identify the conclusion of an argument. It can be in the first half, it can be the second half, it can also be in the middle of an argument. The next important thing is premise. Premise is basically supporting evidence. Sometimes it may not be supporting, but it is always the evidence that is given to uphold this conclusion. Alright, so that is the premise. All the extra information, the facts and figures that are given, an example that is given, a cause and effect relationship that is given, all that is the premise that are basically used to put the conclusion forward. And finally, we have the assumptions, which is basically the unstated link between the premises and the conclusion. If the assumptions are not correct, the argument will be weakened. So that is how we solve the strengthen and weaken questions. If we are going with the assumptions, we are strengthening the argument. And if we are going opposite to the assumptions, if we are showing that the assumptions of an argument are incorrect, we are basically weakening that argument. So this is how you are supposed to strengthen or weaken an argument. And that is why this information is very important, because this information helps you to answer three basic types of questions. One is, what is the assumption over here? Second is, how do you strengthen the argument? And third is, how do you weaken it? Here is an example for you to practice. It says mobile producer X has inserted a new chip into its mobiles to help the battery stay for a longer duration. There has been tremendous growth in sales. So what basically we are saying is that what this company, this producer X is doing is, it is helping to improve the sales. So sales are going up because of this new introduction. So mobile producer Y is planning to introduce the same kind of chip in its products. It expects that its revenues will exceed those of smaller rivals soon. So the basic conclusion is that if Y does the same as X has done, its sales will also increase. Now in this case you can see there is not a proper written down conclusion. There is no words like thus or hence or therefore. So conclusion over here is hidden in a sense. The conclusion would be that if Y does the same as X, it will also see an increase in the sales. What are the premises? All the information that is given to us, that becomes your premise. And what is the assumption in this case? The basic assumption in case of these kind of arguments that involve an analogy is always this, that whatever applies to X applies to Y. Or in the end, the basic assumption is that X and Y are similar. Now if this assumption is correct, this entire conclusion, this entire argument would be strong. However, if you find a way of proving that X and Y are not similar to each other, or the analogy is not correct, or basically that this assumption is not correct, we will be able to weaken the argument. So the strategy that you need to follow is, first of all, read the question stem. You do not have to read the argument first because that would waste time. You would not know what are you looking for. So you should read the question stem. What is the question asking you to do? Is it asking you to find the assumption, the conclusion, the inference, or is it asking you to evaluate the argument, strengthen it, or weaken it? The next step that you need to do is, now you need to go through the argument. You need to find the conclusion, the premises, and the assumption so that you can work upon the argument. The next thing is you have to predict what your answer should do. For example, you've read that you have to find the conclusion. You should predict, and in many cases you must write it down what the conclusion should be, what your answer should do. If it's an assumption, you should make a small list of all the different assumptions that you think are holding the argument together, so that it will be easier to narrow down your answer choices. And once you have the answer clearly in front of us, you have the prediction, you can follow the process of elimination to eliminate all the answer choices that are not going with the answers that you have selected. An important thing to remember is scratch work. Now this differs from person to person. Some people would like to write each one of them, the conclusion, the premise, and the assumptions. Some people would basically form a flow chart. For example, I personally use to form a flow chart for the argument, a kind of diagram that shows me what is happening in the argument and when. However, it's your personal wish, but scratch work should be there 100% of the time. You should have the flow chart or the conclusion, premise, assumption in front of you. Then you should have your answer in front of you. What do you think is the answer? And finally, like sentence correction, you should have your 5 options in front of you, A, B, C, D, E, so that whenever you find an option is wrong, you can eliminate it at the same point of time. And suppose you're left with 2 answer choices, you can easily narrow down your thinking and eliminate one of them based on what your answer is. So let's go ahead and do the questions basically, which are very direct. You just have to find the assumption in that case. But before that, a very important thing is the negation test. Now I told you in an argument you have a premise and you have the basic conclusion. What is unstated between them is the assumption. And I've also told you that if you go with the assumption, it will strengthen the argument. If you go against the assumption, it will weaken this. So what basically is this negation test? For example, you have 5 options in front of you, A, B, C, D, E. Now in all cases it may not be very easy to find out the assumption by reading the argument, so you'll have to choose the options. what you basically have to do in the negation test is negate each option. You have to consider the negative or the exact opposite of all the options. Suppose you take the opposite of A and you see that whether it is strengthening or weakening, but it's not doing anything. That means the original option A had nothing to do with the argument. So that is crossed off. Let's come to B. Suppose when you negate B, the resulting option is also, it's neither strengthening nor is it weakening. That means even B originally was not the assumption. Now suppose you do this for all, and let's say you are left with E. Now you have taken the opposite or the negation of E, and you find that this new option is weakening the argument. Now the opposite of E is weakening the argument. That means E is the original assumption, so that would be your answer. So that is a negation test. Sometimes you may find the assumption quite clearly, but sometimes you may not find it. Plus another case where you have to use the negation test is to verify your answers. It does not take a lot of time, just a couple of seconds to think about the option and the negation of that option in your mind. Just think whatever answer you've chosen. If you take the opposite of that, negation of that, is it weakening the argument or not? If it is weakening, then that means your answer is correct. So the conclusion plus premises, and you have the assumptions, and if you weaken the assumption, you are going to weaken the argument. So here is a question based on assumption, and here are the 5 options. If you want, you can go ahead and pause this video, and you can also try to solve this at your own end. However, we are going ahead with the question. CW, a chain of stores, has relied on a supermarket concept of computerized inventory control and customer self-service to eliminate the category of clerks from its force of employees. It now plans to employ the same concept in selling children's clothes. The plan of CW assumes that. Now we already knew the question, that it's an assumption question since the heading says assumption, so we did not read the question stem first. However, what you should do is you should have at least the options in front of you. So what are the premises and the conclusion telling? That CW is relying on a supermarket concept of computerized inventory control and customer self-service. So that means there is no need of clerks. Now it is trying to employ the same concept in selling children's clothes. So if you see, this is a kind of analogy again. So whatever it was trying to do in the chain of stores, the supermarket concept, it is now trying to employ the same concept in selling children's clothes. So what is the basic assumption? Let's go ahead and try the negation test. When we take option A, it says supermarkets will not also be selling children's clothes in the same manner. If we negate it, it says supermarkets will be selling children's clothes in the same manner. Now tell me, is this new option strengthening or weakening the argument? Well, it is doing none of them. That means A is not the original assumption, so you can easily cross that out. Now B says personal service by the personnel is not required for selling children's clothes successfully. Now if you negate it, it says personal service by personnel is required for selling children's clothes successfully. Now if you see, this option is going to weaken the argument, because what the company, what CW is doing is it's eliminating the category of clerks from its force of employees. That means there will be no personal interaction. And if we take this assumption that personal service is required, that means that the sales will come down. So that means B can be the option. Let's go to C. It says the same kind of computers will be used in inventory control for both clothes and the sales at CW. Now if you go against this option, it says the same kind of computers will not be used in inventory control. Now we are not talking about computers, although we are talking about computerized inventory control, but what is the kind of computer that is being used? That does not have any effect, so no relation at all. C option is not the answer. When we come to D, it says a self-service plan cannot be employed without computerized inventory control. If we take the negation of that, if we say a self-service plan can be employed without computerized inventory control, It is not weakening the argument at all. That means originally option D was not the assumption. And then we have E. Clerks are the only employees of CW who could be assigned tasks related to inventory control. Now we do not even need to negate this option because it is totally out of scope. So hence our answer is going to be B. Now remember, there are a few option types which are usually incorrect in critical reasoning. First of all, the ones that are extreme. Extreme answers are usually incorrect both for critical reasoning and reading comprehension. Answers that have words like must, always, never, no one, all these, unless the same information is mentioned in the passage or the argument. Second is out of scope. If your option is talking about something that does not lie within the scope of the argument, even that option is incorrect. And thirdly, when you have partially correct options. Partially correct means partially wrong, and partially wrong is completely wrong. Alright, so even if you have half correct, half wrong option, it cannot be your answer. Your answer has to be 100% correct. We have another question. A weapons smuggling incident recently took place in country Y. We all know that Y is a closed society. So Y's council must have known about the weapons. And the question we have, which of the following is an assumption that would make the conclusion logically correct? So basically the argument is this, that a smuggling incident took place. Y is a closed society, so Y's council must have known. So let's go ahead and map down our answer choices. And let's write down, an incident took place in Y. Y is a closed society, so Y's council must have known. And what is the basic underlying assumption over here? That somewhere the council has something to do with a closed society. Isn't that the assumption? But let's go ahead and see what option A says. If a council knows about an incident, it must have intended to use the weapons for its own purposes. Now we cannot take that as an assumption, that if a council knew about the incident, what was the basic assumption? So it is out of scope. So A cannot be the answer. Coming to B, if a council claims that it knew nothing, it must have known everything about it. Again, there's no need to apply the negation test. We know that it is not relevant, it is out of scope, it is totally opposite to the actual assumption. C says, if a council does not permit weapons to enter a country, it is a closed society. Now, we do not have any information of permitting weapons, so we cannot say that. Even C goes out of scope. D option says, if a country is a closed society, its council has a large contingent of armed guards patrolling its borders. That is totally irrelevant. It is totally not mentioned. So we are left with option E. It says if a country is a closed society, its council has knowledge about everything that occurs in the country. So this seems like the correct assumption. However, let's try the negation test on it. The negation would be, if a country is a closed society, its council has no knowledge about everything that occurs in the country. Now if you take some time and try to insert this into the argument, you'll find that it is weakening the argument. That means what? That the original option E was the assumption, so the answer is E. So remember one thing, whenever you have assumption questions, you always have to apply the negation test to verify your answer choices. It is very important, and a lot of times you may find that the answer that you have chosen is not correct because it is not passing this negation test. So it's very important for verification purposes. The next question we have again on assumption. A coal power company gained greater profits and provided energy to consumers at lower rates per unit of energy by building larger capacity, more efficient plants, and by stimulating greater use of energy within its area. To continue these trends, the company planned to replace an old plant by a plant with triple the capacity of its largest plant. The question is, the company's plan assumed each of the following except. That means 4 out of 5 options will be the assumptions. The one option That is not the assumption, that is our target. So these are the 5 options in front of us. Let's make a scratch paper. We have mapped down our answer choices. And let's go through the argument once again. The coal power company gained profits and provided energy to consumers at lower rates. So basically we have profits plus lower rates of energy by building larger capacity, more efficient plants. And how this was possible? By better plants, better in capacity, better in efficiency, and stimulating greater use of energy in its area. To continue the trends, the company planned to replace an old plant by a plant with triple the capacity of its largest plant. So basically there is a plan that we can see here. The plan is that if you replace the old plant with a new one with a better capacity, with a higher capacity, that is going to continue the financial trend of having more profits. So as you can see, this is the conclusion. Let's go through each of the options. It says demand for energy within the company's area of service would increase. Now if you see this option, if this option is correct, it would strengthen. And if you take the negation of this option, it would weaken it. That means A is an assumption. So there's no need to cross out because it's an except question, and in except questions never cross out. Always write down what your argument is doing, what your answer option is doing for the argument, so that at the end you can find out the odd man out. B says expenses would not rise beyond the level that could be compensated for by efficiency or volume of operation or both. You can see this is also a basic assumption, because if this is correct, the actual option would be strengthened. However, if you take the negation of this B option, it would weaken it. That means B is also an assumption. Coming down to C. C says the planned plant would be sufficiently reliable in service to contribute a net financial benefit to the company as a whole. Again, it is saying that the new plant would definitely help in achieving the profits that are planned. So that means that C is also the assumption. D says safety measures to be instituted for the new plant would be the same as those for the plant it would replace. Now this can be a problematic information, because if you take the negation of this, safety measures to be instituted for the new plant would not be the same. Now you see D is not having any effect because it's talking about safety measures, which is nowhere mentioned in the argument. That means what? D is out of scope. It is not a proper assumption. Let's go to E. The tripling of capacity would not result in insuperable technological obstacles to efficiency. This is absolutely a correct assumption, because if you weaken it, that the tripling of capacity would cause a lot of technological obstacles, the entire argument gets weakened. So that means E is also the assumption. And now you can compare all your options in the scratch paper and you can see that the odd one out is answer D, which is the correct answer. We have another question on assumption. The increase in the number of newspaper articles exposed as fabrications serves to bolster the contention that editors are more interested in boosting circulation than in printing the truth. Even minor publications have stars to check such apparent fraud. The argument above assumes that. Now we are going to go ahead and find out all these 5 options. Let's put down the answer choices we have. Alright, so we've put down the answer choices. We have to find the assumption. The argument states that increase in number of articles. So that means a lot of fabrications have increased, and it is supporting the contention that editors are more interested in boosting circulation. So their main purpose is boost circulation. And what premise are they giving is that even minor publications have staffs. That means that major publications would definitely be having such staffs to check such apparent fraud. Means staffs are there to check apparent fraud, but in spite of these editing staffs, the editors who are actually interested more in boosting circulation are still able to get these articles published, the fabrications published. So we have to find a link between editors and the fabrications. That would be the assumption. So A says newspaper stories exposed as fabrications are a recent phenomenon. Now it does not depend, it does not matter whether it's recent or not, that is not the assumption. Everything in newspaper prints must be factually verifiable. Again, that is not a basic assumption, because if in spite of that, in spite of the staff to check such fraud, such publications are getting exposed, such publications are getting published. C says fact checking is more comprehensive for minor publications than for major. Now we are not doing any comparison here, that is not the basic underlying assumption. D says only recently have newspapers admitted to publishing intentionally fraudulent stories. Again, the time does not matter at all, so D is also not the answer. E, the editors of newspapers are the people who decide what to print in their newspapers. This is absolutely correct, and this is the underlying assumption that makes the answer E, because if you go against it, if you say the editors are not the people who decide what to print, then we cannot blame the editors that they are more interested in boosting circulation. So that means the entire argument will break down, it will get weakened. So we have verified the answer, and the answer is E. Now we have a question on strengthening. We have a very common question. Research shows that hockey and football players are more quickly moved to hostility and aggression than are athletes in non-contact sports such as swimming. But the researchers' conclusion that contact sports encourage and teach participants to be hostile and aggressive is untenable. The football and hockey players were probably more hostile and aggressive to start with than the swimmers. Which of the following, if true, would most strengthen the conclusion drawn by the psychological researchers? So the researchers' conclusion is here, it is highlighted over here. And these are the 5 options that we have in front of them. Let's map down the answer choices once again. So basically, the research is showing that hockey and football players are more hostile, they are more aggressive. And what the researchers are saying is that it's contact sports that make these sports people more hostile and more aggressive. This is something that we have to prove. Now option A says the football and hockey players become more hostile and aggressive during the season and remain so during the off season, whereas there was no increase in aggressiveness among the swimmers. So this may be a strong contender, because this is going with the assumption that it is contact sports that cause a person to be hostile and aggressive. So let's put this mark over here. B says the football and hockey players, but not the swimmers, were aware at the start of the experiment that they were being tested. Now this does not throw any light, this does not strengthen or weaken. The argument could go either ways if B is taken, so B is not the answer. C says the same psychological research indicated that the football and hockey players had a great respect for cooperation and team play. The swimmers were most concerned with excelling as individual competitors. Now team play and cooperation has nothing to do with being hostile and aggressive, so C is totally out of scope. D option says the research studies were designed to include no athletes who participated in both contact and non-contact sports. Now even if there were such athletes, it would not make any difference, so D is again out of scope. E says throughout the US, more incidents of fan violence occur at baseball games than occur at hockey or football. Now if you see, the argument is not talking about baseball at all, so this one is also thrown out of scope. So that means our answer is going to be option A. Next we have a weakening question for you. Production houses like C Pictures, TCF, etc. provide stock options to their employees. These companies are employing the highest number of people in the industry. There is little reason why most production houses cannot provide the same benefits to their employees. Which of the following, if true, would weaken the argument? Now if you have your scratch paper over here, it's very easy to predict the answer. What your answer should do is that you have to go against this conclusion, that you have to give a reason why the production houses cannot provide the same benefits that the other production houses cannot provide the same benefits. So if you give a reason like that, it would totally weaken this argument. Let's go through the options one by one. So these are the 5 options in front of us. Let's go through option A. Stock options is not offered to all employees of a company. This is totally irrelevant. We are talking about the other production houses, so not relevant. B says C pitches and TCF have fewer members on their board. Now members of board, whether the number is big or the number is small, does not have any effect. C says most other production houses do not have the tax benefits that C and TCF have because they are the biggest employers in the industry. Now this can be a reason. It's giving us a reason. We are looking for a reason, if you remember, in the answer choice. So the reason is tax benefits. There are no tax benefits that these production houses have. So that means that our answer C could be one possibility. D says other production houses have much more business. Now we're not talking about how much business do we have. The trend to offer stock options has not caught on yet. Again, this is not a good reason for the argument to be weakened. Our answer is going to be C. Now remember, as I told you in the beginning of the video, that you always need to have a reason why you are eliminating an option. You need to have a specific reason in mind why you are eliminating something, and you also need to have a reason why you are choosing an option. It's not guesswork that is going on here. You have a specific reason for every action that you're taking in critical reasoning. So with that, we know C is the answer. The next one, again based on weakening. The rate of violent crime in the state is up 30% from last year. The fault lies entirely, look at this word, entirely, in our court system. Recently, judges' sentences have been lenient. Criminals can now do almost anything without fear of a long prison term. The argument above would be weakened if it were true that. Before going to the options, let's just write down our options over here on the scratch paper. It says the violent crime has increased. So violent crime has gone up, and the reason why the argument is saying is because of leniency of the judges. So if we find something that proves this relation to be incorrect, or we give another reason why the violent crime has gone up, that would totally weaken the argument. So let's go ahead and see which of the options does that. Option A says 75% of the other states in the nation have lower crime rates than does this state. Now it's talking about other states, totally irrelevant. B says grey collar crime in the state has also increased. Now what we are talking about is violent crime. Grey collar crime has nothing to do with the argument, so B is incorrect. C says 45% of the police in this state have been laid off. Now this is giving us a reason why crime can increase. So this may be the answer, because it's not leniency of the judges, but the reduction in the police force that is causing the rate of violent crime to go up. So this may be the answer. D says polls show that 55% of the population oppose capital punishment. Now where does punishment come into over here? It's not weakening the argument at all. E says the state has hired 20 new judges to compensate for deaths and retirements. Now if the compensation is being done for deaths and retirements, that means that the total number of judges is still going to remain the same. Because if 20 judges have either died or retired, 20 new judges are coming, so the number of judges has nothing to do with the argument. The answer is going to be C. Another question on weaken. Our work proves to be very successful. In the past 1 year, each of our 5 clients has experienced the fastest growth. It must be fastest growth in their history. Therefore, if your company wants to increase, do not hesitate to call GNG, since we are the solution. Which of the following, if true, most seriously jeopardizes the validity of the argument? Now this is another form of a weakening question. We have the options in front of us. The conclusion says that if you come and call GNG, only then will you be successful. So GNG causes success. If we prove this relation to be false, we'll be able to weaken it. If we show something else can cause success, okay, something else, that this entire argument would get weakened. So let's go through the options. Now these are the 5 options. A says most of the consultants at GNG hold MBA degrees. Now it does not matter what degree do they hold, because nothing about MBA has been mentioned. Even without the help of GNG, the 5 clients of GNG will achieve the same growth rate in sale. Now this may be an answer, because if this is true, that means GNG did not have any part to play. So it will definitely jeopardize the validity of the argument. So B can be the answer. C says GNG is one of the 5 leading management consultant companies. Now this does not matter whether it's at the top 3 or the top 5 or the top 10, or does it come at the 11th position. So C is totally irrelevant. D says GNG uses an updated accounting approach to help companies to cut cost. What kind of approach does it use? Again, not relevant to the argument. E says all of the 5 clients are doing business in financial industry. Now it does not matter in which industry are they doing the business. So E is also totally irrelevant. The answer is going to be B. We have another question, but this one is going to be a very direct question. You just have to find the conclusion of the argument. So here is the argument. The battleship Enterprise is in danger of imploding from laser beams if the warp generators are not meteor resistant. Captain Rock says that no malleable circuits are meteor resistant and all warp generators are made of malleable circuits. What is the conclusion that can be drawn from Captain Rock's reasoning? And you have the 5 options here. So let's go ahead and first of all write down our options. Now what it says is that there is a danger of imploding, or there is a danger against laser beams if the warp generators are not meteor resistant. Alright, so if there is no meteor resistant for the warp generators, then the laser beams can attack the Enterprise and there is a danger of imploding. Captain Rock says no malleable circuits are meteor resistant. So the malleable circuits are also not meteor resistant. All warp generators are made of malleable circuits. That basically equates both of these, that all the warp generators are basically made of malleable circuits. They are not meteor resistant. So in all this information, what is the conclusion? Let's go through option A. It says laser beams do not affect the malleable circuits. Now this cannot be concluded for the argument. It's not the answer. B says the battleship Enterprise is not in danger. However, that is opposite to what is actually happening. Because the warp generators are made of malleable circuits, that means the warp generators are not meteor resistant. That means that there is danger. So B is totally incorrect. It is basically a weakening statement, or it is totally opposite to the answer. C says the Enterprise will implode. Now although this is an extreme answer, but this is actually correct, because this is what is happening. It says there is a danger if they are not meteor resistant, and we know they are not meteor resistant because they are made of malleable circuits, and whatever is made of malleable circuit, that is not at all meteor resistant. So you can form the link over here very clearly. So we know that in any case the battleship Enterprise will implode. But let's go through options D and E as well. D says warp generators are meteor resistant, totally opposite, and E is none of the above. So the answer is going to be C. Now here we have a new type of question, which is evaluate the argument. It's not a strengthening or a weakening question, but a mixture. If you're given an argument, you are basically given the options in the form of questions, right? So options usually in the evaluate the argument kind of question are given to you in the form of questions. So what you have to do is take the extreme ends. Let's suppose the answer is no and the answer is yes. Now either in one case the yes will strengthen, the no will weaken, or in other case the yes will weaken and the no will strengthen. So this must happen. Only then will this option be effectively able to evaluate the argument. Suppose let's take this D option for instance. You take the two extremes. This one is doing nothing and this extreme is also doing nothing. That means this option is doing nothing to evaluate the argument. Let's take this example as well, and you take the two extremes, yes and no. Either this will strengthen and no will weaken, or yes will weaken and no will strengthen. In case this is happening, this option will be useful to evaluate the argument. So let's go ahead and try one question on that. Quite a long argument we have in front of us. Let's put down the options. It says monkeys in Rome often rub a certain type of worm into their fur. Secretions of these worms have been shown to contain two chemicals that are potent bee repellents. In other words, monkeys have potent bee repellents. And bees carry parasites that debilitate the monkeys. That means the bee repellents are actually saving these monkeys, because otherwise bees would affect them and they would carry parasites. So this is the first thing that we know, that monkeys are being saved by the bee repellents. Alright, so we've written that down. The rubbing behavior is rare except during the rainy season when bee populations are at their peak, and this is usually done when bees are very high in terms of number, in terms of their population. And this is the conclusion. You get the word therefore. Therefore, the monkeys probably rub the worms into their fur because doing so helps protect them against bees. Now, which of the following would it be most useful to determine in order to evaluate the argument? So you have 5 questions. Whether the two chemicals provided any protection for the worms against their own predators. Now let's take two extremes. Suppose the answer is yes, and suppose the answer is no. On further evaluation, you'll find that none of them is strengthening and none of them is weakening. You do not get a proper strengthen-weaken pair over here. So that means option A is incorrect. Option B says, whether the type of worm used by the monkeys is found in other parts of the world, totally irrelevant to the question. So B is also incorrect. C says, whether animals other than the E's rub insects of any kind into their fur, totally irrelevant. We are talking about the monkeys only. D says, whether the only time the worms are readily available is during the rainy season. Now if you take two extremities, yes and no, you'll see that yes is strengthening and no is weakening. That means if we get the actual answer to this option D, we will be able to find out whether the argument is strong or it is weak. That means D can be the answer. E says, whether secretions of any other insects accessible to the E's contain chemicals that repel bees. Again, any other insects, totally out of scope. It is irrelevant to this argument. That means the answer is D. Okay, that's all there for this video on critical reasoning. Remember, some of the questions may not be very easy to understand at first, but what I recommend is you pause the video, try to solve those questions on your own, and then you can go ahead and see the answers. And another thing regarding time, right now you can take as much time as you want, but during the test you should be able to come down to an average of 2 minutes per question, because you can save time a lot in sentence correction, but for critical reasoning and reading comprehension you definitely need this time on an average per question. As soon as you think that you're going beyond 4 minutes, that would be an alarming point for you. You should not cross 4 minutes in any condition for any critical reasoning question, and less than 1 minute is also not at all advisable. So basically the strategy that we discussed was you need to read the question stem first, and then what you have to do, you have to go ahead to the argument and find out what your answer should do, and then you have to apply the process of elimination. With that, very important thing is scratch work. Without scratch work, if you keep everything in your mind and do not write it down, it's going to be very confusing, because usually critical reasoning questions at the top 700 level are very confusing to begin with. So scratch work is something that is going to help you. And again, going against the myth that a lot of people hold, every answer will have a reason why it is correct. There has to be a reason for every elimination. There has to be a reason for every answer. There are no guesses. There is no best answer. There is only one answer in these questions. So using all this knowledge, I hope you are able to go ahead and practice some questions. You can use the official guide, you can use the verbal review, which is the official verbal review to get started with, but those two books are completely a necessity if you have to go ahead and prepare for critical reasoning. Beyond that, we are going to have another video which is going to talk about the remaining critical reasoning question types. And you can go ahead and visit this website to get more information, more drills and more videos, and you can share and like our page at facebook.com, and in case of any query or feedback, you can always drop a email. Thank you for now.